I'm Dan Runde. I hold the Schreier Chair. And we're talking about the U.S., rethinking the U.S.-Africa relationship. I think this isn't your grandparents' Africa. It's richer, freer, and more capable. And what I say to policymakers is, to the extent that we don't when I talk to African business leaders, they say, when I say to them, what do you need from the United States? They say, we don't need anything from the United States. The question is, do you want to be a part of this huge opportunity or not? That's the question. And so I think it requires a mind shift for the United States. I think we have to update our cassette tapes. I'm dating myself by saying that. We need to update our cassette tapes about where Africa is. I think in some ways the fact that China sees Africa as an opportunity should be a healthy spur to us updating our playbook. Now, the good news is that the United States, since the Clinton administration, over a period of time, has done a number of steps to move in that direction, but we still need to do more. I think starting with AGOA, if you look at PEPFAR, if you look at Power Africa, administration after administration, we've done it. But we still need to move. I still think we have to move from, let's call it a broadly development and assistance paradigm to what I'd call a cooperation, which includes assistance, a cooperation and trade paradigm. And I think we need to do that. The good news is that we wrote a paper called Paving the Road to Private Investment with Education and Capacity Building. We also did something on, is the U.S. prepared for China to be Africa's main business partner? That's what we called it, and I think that we figured that would be to get people's attention. So if you have trouble sleeping at night, you can read this paper on, is the United States prepared for China to be Africa's main business partner? I'd say the answer is I don't want that to be the case. I think 24 of Africa's sub-Saharan African countries today, the number one trading partner is China, up from 1 in 2001, and that should be a wake-up call for the United States. So doesn't mean we gotta change who we are, but it means we gotta have we need to up our game and change our playbook. And I also think we should see Africa as an opportunity, not a problem to be managed or someplace where we need to necessarily fix things. My friend Mima Nedeljkovic at the Initiative for Global Development is someone who's really helped me think about these issues, and I'm sorry he can't be with us today, but he's been a great partner, and I wanted to thank him personally as well as many of their folks who are here. We have a really interesting program, so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Aaron Walsh, who's the Assistant Secretary for Global Markets at the Department of Commerce, to make some opening remarks. Then we're going to have a panel, and then I'm very pleased that we have an prominent African ambassador here with us today, who's going to be with us too, and I'm going to introduce him later, but I think he is really, Ambassador Kabori from Burkina Faso, because I was like, okay, we're going to have this conversation about the U.S. and Africa and not having Africans on the stage. all of you all would send tweets out and say, Runde, you're doing this event and not having any Africans, you're not serious. So we absolutely had somebody to kind of let's not just talk to ourselves, let's have somebody kind of ground truth this and help us as a country do a better job. So I think we've got a lot of potential, but we could do more, and I'm so pleased we have partners in the U.S. government like Aaron Walsh who understand this. And this all came about because Aaron Walsh invited me to coffee at the State Department and said, Dan, we need to rethink the Africa opportunity. And I said, yes, we should absolutely do it. So that's what prompted all this. So I'm going to ask my friend Aaron Walsh to come up. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be here with all of you who are really, really dedicated to Africa. Most of you have spent your career focused on Africa, and you've seen things happen over time. Each of the countries develop individually, and it's a great opportunity to see and to be able to discuss and have this opportunity with Dan. It was really the commentary paper that Dan and Chris Metzger co-authored was excellent. It was provocative, and it made us think. And I think that, yes, the United States is here with a resounding yes. We are ready to compete. The Trump administration has a real appreciation for the economic and strategic importance of Africa. Economic development across the continent is creating huge demand. Companies from China, India, Turkey, Japan, Europe, and the Middle East are actively pursuing commercial opportunities in Africa, and it is critical for the United States to pivot from an aid-focused to commercial engagement. President Trump highlighted this at the United Nations, the intention to extend economic partnerships with African countries that are committed to self-reliance and fostering opportunities for job creation in Africa and the United States. President Trump signaled in his letter last month to African leaders that this administration will continue to build on this engagement, as indicated through Secretary Ross's ongoing leadership of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. And we are currently planning a trip to Africa with the PAC-DBI team in that capacity to several African countries in the next few months. Secretary Tillerson hosting the African Ministerial in November of 2017, which included extensive discussion on U.S.-Africa cooperation to expand trade and investment ties, as well as his upcoming extended visit to the continent in March. This administration's trade approach to Africa is fully in line with the President's national security strategy announced last month, and the idea that our economic security is our national security is key to this. The National Security Council continues to develop new approaches to African commercial engagement focused on promoting American prosperity and advancing American influence. America will be competing in Africa. Anyone who has traveled to sub-Saharan Africa recently has seen the huge investment that the Chinese are making in support of their companies in the marketplace. For each person that we have on the ground, China has 40. This reality demands a strategic approach to share intelligence more effectively across all U.S. government agencies that have a piece of the economic engagement with Africa, while better coordinating our efforts to support the expansion of American businesses in market, and the Commerce Department will play a vital role. This has taken on a two-pronged approach. We are strategically assessing Commerce's key opportunities to add value to U.S. companies' efforts to strengthen and expand their presence in African markets, target results, and execute those plans. We have 11 teams of country experts in the country and in Washington, D.C., with 8 teams focused on sub-Saharan African countries and 3 teams focused on North African countries. Each team has developed a country strategy using a data-driven approach, identifying target sectors and opportunities in markets, and linking those to U.S. companies. Those opportunities, while prioritizing foreign barriers most inhibiting the success of African companies. That is one of the core missions of this PAC-DBIA, is to work on some of those inhibiting non-tariff barriers. Coordinating with the NSC very, very closely, literally on a daily basis, we are working with our interagency colleagues for more effective collaboration to support African and American companies competing for opportunities on the continent. The idea is to marshal the resources of the interagency as a whole to identify commercial opportunities in different areas and in key export markets by drawing on contacts in key ministries, state-owned enterprises, and major procuring private sector companies to determine potential spending plans in areas that American companies are highly competitive. Commerce can work with the interagency colleagues here and in embassies and consulates overseas to flag these opportunities and circle back to U.S. companies. Once these identifications are made, the Commerce Department's domestic networks of professionals located in over 100 cities across the United States will alert these U.S. companies whose profiles demonstrate that they could be most competitive in addressing the opportunities and demand. Finally, once American companies are paired with opportunities, the commercial-led interagency effort facilitates the development of contacts, advises on market strategies, and advocates in cases where American firms are going head-to-head with third country competitors championed by their respective governments. We have another approach that has been used and is currently under discussion. This approach can produce a memorandum of understanding negotiated with trading partners. We have had the private sector indicate just how effectively these can work, and they have the capability to help push forward deals that can have a significant impact on American exports and jobs. President Trump's national security strategy clearly indicates that we must prioritize economic security, and that is truly in our national security interests. This whole-of-government approach to helping American businesses succeed in Africa is essential in order to address the realities of our international engagement and competition. Thank you so much, and I look forward to continued discussions with this wonderful group of panelists, and a special thanks to CSIS for hosting us and for Dan for leading such an amazing, provocative engagement for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, let me ask the panelists to come up, please. So that's Ed, Tom, Del, Lori. Thanks. Okay, so Flory, so we've got my friend Flory Leeser, who runs the Corporate Council on Africa. We got Tom Hardy, he's the acting head of USTDA, a government agency. We have Del Reniger of General Electric, and we have Ed Burrier, who's a senior official at OPIC, a government agency. So I think we've got an interesting group to tackle this issue about how do we do a better job of reframing the Africa conversation as an opportunity and not just a problem to be managed. So, Flory, you do this for a living. You think about this. You're at the Corporate Council on Africa. You've had a distinguished career in government. So, what would you? I think one question is, what would you tell our friends in the American government? What do we need to be doing to reframe this conversation? What would you tell members of Congress? What would you tell the executive branch? And how do we do a better job? And what do we need to do?
So thank you for, first of all, bringing some focus on this issue. In fact, the size of this room and the fact that it's so packed out is just a reflection of how much interest there is in engaging more effectively with Africa. So next time we'll have to have a bigger room, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Like next time bring a bigger boat, we need to bring a bigger room. That's right.
That's right. So I think, first of all, everyone knows why U.S. companies want to be in Africa. It's the same reason that everybody else from all around the world wants to be in Africa. Second fastest growing region in the world, 350 million people in the middle class, a burgeoning youth on the continent that are going to drive the market and the kinds of products and services that can be sold there. The African workforce is going to be probably accounting for almost half of the global workforce in another 10 or 15 years. And so, there are lots of reasons why our companies want to be there. The issue that gets raised regularly is how can the playing field be leveled to allow U.S. companies to compete more effectively with all of the companies from around the world that are there. And so I think many times the discussion sort of turns to China. China's eating our lunch. Everyone knows that the China-Africa trade is now the largest Africa trading relationship. And so people are sort of, we've got to try to do what China's doing. But in fact, if we're honest about it, the U.S. is never going to operate like China operates. What we need to do is to look at not just what China's doing and the tools and mechanisms they're using to support engagement with Africa, but we need to look at what Europeans are doing, the Brazilians, the Indians, Malaysians, so many that are operating on the continent, and we need to take that and look at the tools that we have here in the U.S., the initiatives and tools we have, and see what it is that we can adapt so that we can support U.S. companies more effectively on the continent. And just a few ideas that I have, but
Please.
Reflected by so many. So we need to have more flexible and quickly deployed export financing facilities. And those facilities like OPIC, Exim Bank, and TDA, they need full support, staffing, and funding. We need greater coordination across U.S. government agencies and mechanisms for actually working together more effectively, like we've been doing in Power Africa, for example. And we need to engage the full range of U.S. government agencies that have programs in Africa. For example, not forgetting agencies like USDA and HHS and CDC, which are also on the continent. One question I have is, who is tracking and mapping how programs of numerous U.S. government agencies operating in Africa are linked or interconnected? I don't know of any organization that's doing that, any government agency that's doing that. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could make sure that staff that is working, for example, from USAID on food security actually knew all of what was being done by USDA, and the two of them were working with HHS on issues related to African health. All of that is one sort of related set of things that we should know about, but we don't seem to know about, and we're not tracking it here in the U.S. Another thing is we need more advocacy at higher levels for U.S. businesses competing for lucrative commercial contracts on the continent. In my former days as Assistant USTR for Africa, every once in a while I'd be sitting in a hallway waiting for a meeting, and in would walk, Angela Merkel or, someone really senior, and have a whole group of businesses walking in the door as well. Now, we don't do that here. No president, Republican or Democrat does that. But why don't we have more cabinet level people going to the continent and taking businesses there? We know that this is something, I'm sure others will speak to it, Dell from GE, but this is why Secretary Ross's upcoming trip to a number of countries in Africa with the PAC-DBIA, the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, is so important. But let that not be the only one. And let's make sure that it's not sort of once a year we show our face in Africa. We should be having regular, high-level, cabinet-led trade missions to Africa, especially since our head of state, our president, generally speaking, does not do that kind of thing. Again, I just think that we need to be more visible on the continent. We need to be more supportive of our businesses that want to level the playing field. We need to be savvy about what U.S. offers. We need to coordinate more with the private sector here. And I think that that's something that is going to be beneficial. U.S. companies, maybe they're at a disadvantage in some ways on the continent when they're competing with others, but I think we know that there are also some unique things that they bring to the continent. Our projects and products tend to be high quality. There's more value for dollar, and in terms of the life cycle of projects, we're welcomed on that on the continent. So no, we can't necessarily be the cheapest or compete with others who might be able to do things at the lowest cost. But it doesn't mean that we can't be effective. We can bring our technology and skills transfers that we tend to do more than others, and let's build on our strengths.
Florrie, thank you very much. I think those are really, I agree with everything you've said, and thank you very, very much. Tom?
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the paper. I think it's important right now that we be thinking about where and how do we engage Africa and advance our U.S. companies' interest. And picking up on what Florrie was saying about the visibility and support of the U.S. government across Africa, preparing for today, I was looking at statistics. Where is the demand? And it's quite amazing. In this environment, and I'll talk about why I think this is the case, but over the last 2 years, USTDA has received over 550 proposals for projects across the continent, from the public sector in Africa, from private sector U.S. companies to support energy projects, but has only had the resources to support 4% of those projects. The demand is there. We're responding where we can. And also, the innovation and the support. Last year alone, For every single pilot project USTDA financed, it was supporting a small business that was looking to get onto the continent to advance their unique technology, where the Africans were hungry for that U.S. solution. But the game has changed, I would argue. 16, 17 years ago, when I started working in Africa, U.S. companies wanted the U.S. flag to be wrapped around the U.S. solution. Today, they're facing China. They're facing state-owned enterprises. They're facing heavy subsidization, concessional loans, and the competitive nature of the engagement is just different. I think it's important to look back at the president's national security strategy, where he specifically noted that China's investing in emerging markets to expand their influence and gain a competitive advantage against the United States. He further went on to say, specifically in Africa, that some Chinese practices are undermining Africa's long-term development by corrupting elites, dominating extractive industries, and locking countries into unsustainable debt. USTDA is uniquely positioned to be a commercial driver to support U.S. industry's effort to expand opportunities and expand business opportunities across the continent. Over the last 3 years, USTDA has tripled its financing of projects across Africa. Sponsoring, as an agency's project preparation agency, we're supporting activities. They're supporting quality infrastructure projects from LNG terminals to airport terminals. They're designed to help African public and private sector officials to make informed investment decisions based on quality, not simply the lowest cost. We're winning. We're not winning enough, but resources are being aligned, working with ARIN, working with OPIC, working across the government to advance our efforts to support U.S. companies. So I think the position, we're moving in the right direction, but more can be done. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me just ask you, Tom, so what else could the USG be doing? If you had a magic wand, you had 3 wishes, what would you ask for?
You know, I think that the pieces are being put in place. I think the recognition of China as a strategic competitor across Africa is an important paradigm shift. I think the discussions taking place with the Commerce Department, the trade mission that Secretary Ross is going to be leading, is going to be putting forward that the USA message that we're committed to the African continent.
Let me just push just a little bit further. So AID, PEPFAR, MCC is spending $10 billion, is it $10 billion a year in Africa? I think it's $10 billion a year. In the last 10 years, we've put $100 billion into Africa in foreign assistance. In the last 20, we've put between $150 billion and $180 billion. This is bilateral aid. This isn't the World Bank. This isn't the African Development Bank. This isn't OPIC. This is ODA. Some of it touches. So how do we've touched on this a little bit. How do we convert sort of the big spend, the $10 billion spend we're doing on the continent for good stuff? We're bending the curve on HIV/AIDS. We're trying to turn Africa, be a partner to Africa as it hopefully becomes another breadbasket like Brazil so that we can feed 9.5 billion people. How do we turn that in? Can you just spend a minute on that, please?
Sure. I think USTDA is doing just that. I think Africa, under Power Africa, is a perfect example. What we have invested in energy projects across the continent is designed to leverage $12 billion in investment. So we're taking a small amount of money, small amount of investment by USTDA, and leveraging it by 250 times what we're investing to open up markets for U.S. companies.
Okay, I just feel like we're like the kids in the high school play who are doing all the scut work, like doing the sets and the costumes and writing the script, and we're doing all the unglamorous stuff. We're bending the curve on malaria and capacity building this, and elections monitoring that, and blah. And then the Chinese waltz in and taking all the good stuff. So how, doesn't that strike you as a little annoying? Is it just me?
No, it is annoying. You're correct, Dan. But I think that there's a lot of success there. There's a lot of success working in Ethiopia, working with a company from Illinois called Gates Air, where the U.S. government aligned our resources, the State Department, the Commerce Department, USTDA, to go directly against the Chinese. The Chinese have invested $6 billion in the Ethiopian telecom sector, and we went head-to-head against the Chinese.
Right, so we're spending all on the soft stuff. We're doing the health and then they're doing all the business stuff. So
No,
how do we
I'm saying-
crosswalk the soft money we're spending? And so what you're saying is Power Africa is an example,
I'm
right?
saying just the opposite. They were doing the soft stuff. China's invested $6 billion. We went head-to-head against the Chinese on a commercial deal for tens of millions of dollars, where the Chinese government was heavily subsidizing their competition, and the USTDA, Commerce, and State went head-on against the Chinese and ended up turning that procurement directly for the U.S. solution, which is supporting 7 companies across 4 states in the United States.
Okay, so let me just one last question. So it's not a good idea to zero out TDA in the budget? I'm just asking that question, just saying.
I will let others on the panel opine about the future of USTDA. I will say, though, I think it's important to note that as an agency, we've had full funding.
Maybe not do that, right?
And,
I'm
and
just
our,
saying.
our nose is to the grindstone, advancing U.S. interests.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you, both of you, is this is a question of making a couple of, let's not do stupid things, and like zero out TDA, or let's zero out OPIC, or let's do some adulting around things like the Exim Bank, and then let's work more strategically. And it's not necessarily about let's double our ODA spend. This isn't about doubling our foreign aid budget. This is about working a little bit more smartly and lowering the little bit of Washington dysfunction, and then updating our cassette tape. Is that what I'm hearing? Can you respond to that?
Yes. Is there a longer answer? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Del, thanks for being here. You've been a voice of reason in Washington on these issues for a long time. So, you hear this conversation, like what's our homework assignment? What should the U.S. be doing better so that, you represent American business. There are a lot of fine American companies here. What else should we be doing?
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here with so many friends and colleagues. I would say that we need to be a heck of a lot more intense on the commercial opportunities. This is real business. Our growth in sub-Saharan Africa has basically tripled over the last several years, and I think if I were to come back next year, I would tell you it would be quadrupled, which would basically mean that sub-Saharan Africa for GE is the size of India. And then if we turn and add North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa, we're now approaching the size of China in terms of the opportunities for GE. So this is real business. And I still don't necessarily think that it's being treated as real business. And I think there are a couple of things that we need to do. First is definitely all of the financing issues that you've raised. The reality is that our competitors, and it's not just China, a lot of our competitors from Europe, a lot of our competitors from Japan and elsewhere in Asia bring financing. They bring EPC, so we call it EPC plus F. So they have boots on the ground, engineering, procurement, and construction firms. And then they bring financing from their governments, and they wrap it all together in a project-specific MOU that's done at the government-to-government level, and it just happens automatically at a speed that we simply can't match. So we definitely need to get all of our financing tools back on the table. It's absolutely outrageous that we're approaching 3 years without Exim Bank.
I'd use the term absurd and irresponsible. I mean, it's insane. It's insane.
It is, but so that's a big piece of it. The other piece of it, though, is looking more about how we can be more intense. When you see other governments bringing all of their heads of state, bringing all of their ministers, doing constant conferences, constant bilateral meetings, constant trade missions, it just has this feeling of constant pressure. And I think it fundamentally goes back to treating this as the real business opportunity that it is. One of the interesting things about the President's Advisory Committee on Africa is, first of all, President Trump and Secretary Ross continued this advisory committee from the Obama administration. I think that point is often overlooked. So the president and the secretary recognized early on that this was a strategic play that they needed to maintain. This isn't about politics. This is about business and opportunity. Second of all, our work right now around PAC-DBIA is no longer what do the African countries need to do to attract U.S. investment. It's much more of a focus on what do we need to do in order to compete as Americans in Africa, which I think is a huge inflection point, because the reality is that these are 30-year opportunities in the infrastructure space. The doctors, the engineers, the scientists, the workers, they're learning their skills now. They're being trained. They're learning how to maintain on non-U.S. equipment. And so if we are not in there right now, we're out of this market for the next 30 years. That is a huge strategic opportunity that we're going to miss. So we have to get our game face on. We have to show up. We have to be on the continent. We have to bring our leadership there. We have to bring all of our financing tools. And we not only need to do a much better job coordinating among the government, but we also need to do a much better job coordinating with the World Bank and all of the regional development banks. And the final point that I would make is that we, to your point, Dan, about the kids at the high school play, we don't have the intensity of focus on specific projects. Our approach typically has been let's kind of set the climate, and then 1,000 flowers will bloom. And instead, what we see is other governments focusing on specific projects. And this is greatly appealing to African leaders because they have elections too, which is a good thing. We want them to have elections. And we want them to be able to have deliverables like American politicians. They want deliverables as well. And being able to say, here is a hospital that has been built, here is a railroad that has been built, here is a power plant that is up and running in a 2 to 4 year election period is a lot more meaningful to them. And as we all know, political will is often the biggest challenge to getting projects in addition to financing done. And our strategy, I would just say, is simply not working if we're only focused on the climate and we're not focused on bringing specific projects forward and we're not being proud about it. We ought to be loud and proud about all the work that we do on the continent.
Okay, so I think I'm optimistic. I want us to think, I want us to come back a year from now, 2 years from now, but I think that the Trump administration has all the ingredients to turn the Africa conversation into a business opportunity. I think with folks like Aaron, with folks like Mark Green, with folks like H.R. McMaster, as I think someone like Secretary Tillerson, with folks like Ray Washburn, I think that as we, I want to believe, and I do believe that I think I'm going to come back in 24 months' time, and I'm very optimistic. I think there's a case to be very optimistic that we're going to get this right and build, and I think it's in line with an arc of American administrations over the next, over the last 20 years. And I'm hopeful that over this term that we're gonna get there. So I think I've been so pleased to, partner with Aaron Walsh at the Commerce Department on this. So I know there are many people in the government who understand this and get this. And so I think that there's a big opportunity. I think there's just a couple points I want to just reflect on what you were saying, Del, which is like only 2% of U.S. companies export. That's something that was a shocking statistic to me. And so I think we have to also do a better job of getting American companies to actually export. I know we're going to hear from the ambassador in a minute, but I don't know how many American companies have actually been to Africa, and they've got kind of a distorted vision from what you see in the TV. I'm not going to describe all the stuff that you see on TV, but it's not this conversation. Let me put it that way. And so so I think it's not just about money, but it's also about opportunities and identifying deals. And how does the U.S. government do that? And I think the Commerce Department has a role in that, and the USG has a role in that. And so I think we need to do a better job of that. And so I'm optimistic. I think there's a case to be made, and I also think to the extent that the kinds of smart folks like yourself that are working with the USG on this, that I think we can do a better job. So I'm confident that that if we collectively just get our act together just a little bit more, and I think there are all the ingredients for that, we can have I want to have a better conversation in 2 years' time. And so I'm optimistic that it's not a big, we need $5 billion in foreign aid to fix this. That's not the answer to this. There's it's a mindset shift. It's getting our interagency a little bit better. It's all the things that you're hearing Flory and Tom and Del talk about. Thank you very, very much. Okay, Ed, I'm a huge fan of OPICS, a development finance agency of the United States. I don't know the exact percentage of your business that's in Africa. I think it's I don't know, out of the $4 billion, you're doing $1 billion in Africa, something like that?
Over $7 billion out of a portfolio of $23.2 billion.
Okay, so a third of your portfolio is in Africa. Well, that's fabulous. And so talk about how does OPIC fit into this conversation?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dan, for having us here, and thanks to CSIS for being such a center point for critical thinking on these topics. And it's a real honor to be on stage with folks like Flory. I was joking with her before we came in that 18 years ago, my first job on Capitol Hill was an intern at the Africa Subcommittee, doing calls to offices to ask them about the African Growth and Opportunity Act and whether they would support it, and Flory was so instrumental in that. And back in those days, I worked for Congressman Ed Royce, and he used to beg people to invest in Africa. And on the stats, in 2002, OPIC's portfolio was about $1 billion in Africa, and now we're over $7 billion. But as kind of Del and others have alluded to, we really need to step up our game. And I think that the good news here is that the administration is hearing that call. Last week in the president's budget, or last year, there was an executive order on reorganizing government, which kind of really forced a fresh look at the development finance tools across government. And at the end, what came out is the administration's proposal for a standalone development finance institution. This is kind of looking at combining the tools of OPIC and USAID's Development Credit Authority. If you're coming to a Dan Runde event, you know what development finance is. But for those at home, we're talking about loans, loan guarantees, political risk insurance to U.S. companies to invest in emerging markets. So last month I was in Togo. Until a few years ago, Togo had less electricity capacity per capita than Afghanistan. A U.S. company called Contour Global came in. We loaned them money. They set up a power plant. It tripled the country's capacity to generate electricity. Now they've got a chance to power their economy. We get paid back with interest. So that's your kind of classic case of development finance. And so with this new kind of DFI, the administration really is kind of looking to elevate this tool, have it more integrated with the state and USAID and within the national security system. It was a big part of the president's national security strategy, which came out in December. So this is really the critical next step. We were talking before we came in about where does the U.S. have comparative advantage? And I think just from my perspective, we have deep capital markets. There's a lot of money out there with people looking to invest in opportunities, but the axiom that capital is a coward holds true, and it needs a little bit of support, and if it can get a little bit of political risk insurance or a little bit of stake from a loan from OPIC or this new DFI, it really has the chance to kind of catalyze this private capital so that people can invest and really create opportunities for these countries to grow.
So Ed, we got to put OPIC on triple steroids, is my view. I mean, I think we ought to just put you guys on triple steroids. And so I'm really glad that there is this discussion about a new DFI with new capacities. So I'm very excited about that. I think it's great that President Trump is pushing that. I also think there's some wonderful champions like Senator Coons and others. I think they've just been great. I hope it happens, and I want it to happen. It's very, very important. So, Ed, you worked for Ed Royce, a hero for our time, a great American, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was an Africanist before Africa was cool. So who's going to replace him on the Republican side in the House? Who's going to fill in his shoes and be a champion, a voice for Africa in the Republican Party to follow behind in the House?
Oh, God.
Because we're going to need somebody like him to carry this flag.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm going to say, I really am, thank you for the kind words about my old boss. He really did. Someone asked me the other day to characterize his work in Africa in a few sentences, and I wrote him back a big 2-paragraph long response. But he's a guy that deeply cared about these issues, was doing it before everyone else was paying attention to it, and it wasn't there was no political payback that he was doing it for. He was just doing it for good policy. But I think the only response I'll give to you, I spent a long time on Capitol Hill, did a lot of things with my boss to help him accomplish. They always had common denominators, and everything was bipartisan. And it also, if you had a few champions just in each house, you can get a lot done. And usually it's the things that are not on the front page of the newspaper. And so while he'll be missed, I know there's going to be other people that'll step up.
We're going to need a
keep the
Republican
focus.
to fill his spot, because I think that's going to be, so we need to find that person. We don't have it, we got to find it. So that's everyone collective homework assignment. We got to find a Republican who's going to fill Royce's shoes, because we're going to miss. It's going to be a lot. He's retiring, and it's a huge loss for the country and for this conversation. So we have to figure out ways to keep him involved too, because he's just a hero for a time, a great American. Okay, so we've had this conversation. We've sort of had an American conversation. I need the ambassador to come up and kind of could you just sanity check this for us, Ambassador? I mean, we're having this conversation amongst ourselves. Why don't are we going to have him speak from the podium? So, Ambassador, we've had this discussion about how can we be a better partner to Africa, and we don't have any Africans on the stage, and so it's completely absurd for us not to have a senior African like yourself, Ambassador Kabore from Burkina Faso. Could you just reflect on what you've heard and just tell us what is your country and what does the continent want and need from the United States? And just tell us, are we on the right track here?
Thank you, sir. Morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Rumde. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
I don't know this guy, but this morning I've been very influenced by the way you managed the meeting. Thank you very much. According to what I've heard this morning, I'm very happy to know that the U.S. state government and the U.S. businesses are really interesting to go forward with Africa. But before moving forward on my vote, I would like to give some figures. The relationship between the U.S. and Africa are based mainly on the aid. And for the aid, we can thank Power Africa, MCC, for what they have done. Unfortunately, in the other hand, we discovered that in the economic side, if you take a program like AGOA, for me personally, the result of AGOA is a little bit mitigated. Why? We discovered that from the period they set up this program in 2000 until 2006, 90% of the businesses between the United States and the African continent are based on crude petroleum with no added value. And since 2013, we discovered that the export to the United States have started to decrease and still decreasing because the United States itself has its own petrol. So it's something that the result is really, really mitigated. And in Africa, and we can discover that for the business, the real business, the relationship between the United States and Africa for the exportation is a tiny, insignificant share of 1.5 of the total exportation of the United States to Africa. So that means that there is not a real trade between the United States and Africa. But nowadays, our in Africa, all the countries are convinced that aid only can help country to move forward. Aid only cannot help a country to create wealth, jobs, in one word, development. So you need to change the paradigm.
Yes.
So I can tell you that Africa have promising, how can I say, opportunities. I can give you some information that maybe you already knows. You have abundant resources in Africa. In the mining, agriculture sectors, the economic growth is appreciable, 3.5 to 7% a year. By 2050, the population will double at 2.5 billions. And 60% of this population will be under 25. 40% of this population will live in urban areas, and 32% of this population, about 800 million people, will have good education skills and purchasing power. And other point is that thanks to the African Development Bank, Africa has new vision for development. They call it high fives. The first one is to light up and power Africa through a new deal on energy for Africa to make energy affordable, reliable, and efficient. 2, feed Africa, unlock the agricultural potential to improve the life of more than 70% of the population. Industrialize Africa, processing local production and creating more added value. Integrate Africa, build a strong transport infrastructure to integrate Africa economy. And last, improve the quality of the life for the Africa people by enhancing education, technical skills, and health. So I think that thanks to this promising potential and a new vision, African market can be considered as a new target for the global powers countries and for even the United States to have a win-win partnership. So if I take the example of the China today, you see, China is
Mainland China.
Eh?
Mainland China.
Mainland China.
Right.
Today, it's like China is becoming very dangerous for the United States. I don't know.
I don't know.
But what we are discovering is that from 2000 to 2016, the businesses from China moved from $10 billion to $220 billion. At the same time,
In Africa.
In Africa.
Yeah.
At the same moment, the United States stayed at only $20 billion. So, and the Chinese, they found solution for the funding. They found the kind of government-to-government loans and grants at a low cost to push infrastructure in Africa, in roads, railways, ports, telecommunication, etc. And the Chinese, at the level of the head of state, they have each 3 years meeting between the head of state of the China and African countries. That is very important. That is very important because in Africa, we are very respectful of our head of state. It's very important for us to know. So I think that, but for me, it's not late. It's not late for the United States. It's not late. And I think that the United States have a lot of advantages. You dominate really globally some sectors like agricultural technologies, energy, higher education, finance, consulting, data, pharmaceutical and medical equipment, security, and military equipment. So I think that the American can do better. But for that, they have to really know what is in Africa. They have to know what are the real potential in Africa. They have to go there. You can't stay here and say that you want to work with Africa. You want to go on the ground. And for that, I think that we can give two roles to the one end to the American government and the other end to the private sectors. For me, I think that the American government should do more than what they are doing now, what is very good for us, but they can do more. I take the example of the condition of financing with the World Bank. The United States government is a big partner of the World Bank. When I check in the document, I can see that there is a report, the relation between the debt and the GDP of the America. The debt represents 104% of the GDP of the United States. But in my country, we are only at 36%. But when you go to the World Bank and say we need a lot of money, they say no. You can't move ahead because you have a lot of debt. But I can tell you that it's not possible to change the condition of life of people without investing in the sustainable infrastructure. Only infrastructure can produce wealth, can create jobs, and can give hope to the population. And for the businesses, I think that they can go find partners and work there. And in the case of my country, because you asked me for Burkina Faso, we are really poor, but we have some advantage too. We have energy. The solar is there. We have mining sector, and we have a huge potentiality in agriculture. So we need that the American businesses come there and find partners so we can work a lot and link this country and all the African countries to the global added value chain. So for me, all the strategies in order to enhance African economic growth should address the question how to facilitate the integration of the African economy to the global added value chain. Not based on the local market. We have to go everywhere and sell our product. And so creating job will be, how can I say, a hope for the future generation. So they will throw in the past the painful issues of immigration and insecurity. So I think that all the world will award America for helping the others to move ahead. And I'm sure that you have seen or heard of a fictional African country of Wakanda.
Yes.
Do
Do you have vibranium? Do you have vibranium?
Yes,
in
we
Burkina
have it.
Faso?
We have it. And we can do win-win businesses. Thank you, sir.
So I think there's two questions, and then I'm going to open it up. The first is, who do we want African countries to say was their partner 30 years from now in the next stage of their development? They're going to be richer. There's going to be there's going to be a middle class in Africa. It's going to be urban. There's going to be a series of middle income and upper middle countries. Do we want to look back 30 years and say, thanks, China. That was great. You are such a great partner. Or do we want them to say, thanks, United States. I prefer option B. Yes. This is my opinion. So it seems to me that's the question. It's a slightly different frame of how we think about Africa. How do we, and so then I think my friend Mima Nedeljkovic would say, okay, Dan, we need to move from what can we do for Africa to a different question, which is what can the United States and Africa do together for a win-win? That's the operative question. I think when I listen to Flory, I listen to the other panelists, I listen to Aaron Walsh, I listen to the ambassador, that's the operative question that I think we have to grapple with over the short to medium term, so that 30 years from now, when we look back, when Africa says, boy, you are a great and reliable partner on this next phase of our development. It's not just moving from an aid to a cooperation and trade paradigm. Ambassador, if you're willing to stick around, I'd like to open it up, the conversation out to some folks. I'd like to hear from, so I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to hear from at least a couple of folks from the African continent. I just think this is an absurd discussion if we just don't have some folks from the African continent. I want to hear from my friend Peter Voike, who was an Africanist before Africa was cool. And then I want to hear from at least one. So I've got these two folks. So here's the ground rules, though. You have to say your name, who you are, and you have to keep it to less than 1 minute so that we can all kind of share, and then I'll hear from that gentleman back there. So these two ladies here, 1 minute, and then I'm going to cut you off after a minute because we got to share here, folks, okay?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mr. Rand, for this wonderful. This is what we have been asking everybody in Africa. What you brought today has been a question to everybody. So thank you for answering our question with the panel. My question is, with all these companies in Africa, Africa has been there, China, as the ambassador say, has come in, has developed. Africa cannot grow without urbanizing the rural area. All big companies looked at oil, minerals, and big things to make them rich, and working with the ministers, they have left things that affect common person, like agriculture. My question is, how do we, I forgot to say my name. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of Segeros International Group. How do we work with small business? I focus on small businesses on agriculture. So how do we urbanize rural areas than the urban areas to work with small and medium companies to grow the economy of Africa? Because small companies are the growth of any country here in the United States and all over the world. So what do these companies that are doing? And this is what China is doing in Africa. Americans go to tour and travel in Africa, but the Chinese go to do business. So how do we work together?
Pass the microphone to this lady here. Then we hear from this gentleman with the camera, and I want to hear from my friend Peter Voike. We'll
Hello, Joyce Rogers Holiday. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association of African NGOs. I didn't hear anything in the conversation on the impact of the diasporans in basically engaging to source investments in their various countries. I know that right now my country, Nigeria, is having that conversation of using their diasporans in sourcing investments and partners globally to drive investments in the country. And I didn't hear in any part of the conversation, I didn't hear anything about the diasporans. It's very important and impactful.
How many people of Nigerian origin live outside of Nigeria?
Oh my goodness, there's a whole lot of them. I can't tell you the figure. Yes.
Is it
More
10
than-
million?
It's more than that. It's a whole lot, but I can't tell you the figure. I'm not sure about the figure.
I would say,
Well,
Dan, one thing on the diaspora,
let me
of the 4,000 people we have in Africa, over 80% are Africans,
Yeah.
and a big chunk of them are diaspora. So what we
Yes.
found as an Africa strategy for companies is you need to recruit African diaspora to
Yes.
go back home and run your businesses.
Yeah, we'll double click on that. That is the fabulous question.
Thank you.
I want to hear from the gentleman with the camera. Name, serial number, keep it short.
I've forgotten my serial number, I'm sorry. This is Daniel Renches from Feature Story News. We do broadcast news for people all around the world and 3 broadcasters in Africa. My question is very specific. What do the panelists recommend that US strategy should now be toward South Africa as it begins to transition its political situation and look outside of its own borders? Thank you.
Thank you. And you get an A+ for short question. Thank you. That's modeling good behavior. I want to hear from my friend Peter Voike. Peter Voike is the former head of the International Finance Corporation. He was a managing director of the World Bank. He was a partner at JP Morgan. He's a senior advisor here at CSIS and was an Africanist before Africa was cool.
Thanks, Dan. I'm getting used to being put on the platform. I just wanted to go back what the ambassador said, and I think that is extremely important, and I think the Americans haven't really followed too much on that. The whole development in Africa was driven by development institutions who told the Africans what they needed. But I think the Africans need to be asked, and they need to be engaged, they need to be partners. And we need to understand better what Africa really needs. And China, despite all the money, et cetera, we diddled around at the World Bank about infrastructure. The Chinese recognized that's what the Africans really wanted, and they big time went in and built the infrastructure, trains, roads, et cetera, et cetera. I think the US has a huge advantage because it was just mentioned. You have a big diaspora here. You have the biggest Ethiopian community here. You have a big Ghanaian community. You have African community. All these expats reinvest in Africa. They are knowledgeable. Take advantage of them. Hire them. You have them at the universities here in the United States. Take advantage of them. You understand Africa better, and you will do a better job in Africa. It's as simple as that.
Ambassador, could I ask you first to respond to some of these comments about the diaspora? Could you respond to, and I'll do another round. Hear Peter Voike's comment, this issue of, and then I'd like to hear from the panelists as well. Anything you want to respond to. You don't have to respond to all of it, but is there one or two things that you want to just respond to?
Okay. I would like to respond on the question of the First Lady.
Yeah, the rural, urban, and how do we take advantage of the rural?
Yes. I think that I don't like to talk about Chinese example, but unfortunately, they are more aware of what is doing in Africa. Our country doesn't have a relationship with China. We are working with Taiwan, but unfortunately, we have to recognize that China has a good idea of Africa. And for the industrialization, they have two main ideas. The first one, for the light industry, they know that there is a kind of a cyclical rotation of this industrialization. So the industrialization from light level moves from country to countries. Even China, they benefit from South Korea, Japan, America, European countries. And from 2000, the GDP of China moved to 1 trillion to 12 trillion, near America, the United States, which is at 19 trillion. They are not far. But they started, in 2000, they were very down because of the industrialization. And the cost of life have changed, the living costs have changed a little bit in China. So in the past time, someone can accept a wage of like 100, but today you have to pay like 700. So the China, they have decided to relocate the light industry in Africa. So they are involved on this process, and they are on the ground helping African countries to set up this kind of industrialization according to each country comparative advantages. In Ethiopia, they have built a lot of company of shoes. In Rwanda, they are in the textile and apparel. The same in Uganda. They are planning to do something in Senegal according to the advantages in Cote d'Ivoire too. So I think that is some example that the United States can be inspired and move ahead with the cooperation with African countries, is the point that I have to add.
Great.
Thank you.
Could I ask the panelists to respond to some of the comments there? And then I'm wondering if someone from either the Commerce Department or someone else in the news government could respond to this issue of South Africa, or could have a view on the South Africa question. But Flory, let me ask you let's just go down the panel, and I'd like someone to be able to respond to the South Africa question.
So I think that the point about diaspora is very important. I think that one of the linkages that we should be looking at is also the role of diaspora as small and medium-sized enterprises. So here in the U.S., a lot of SMEs drive economic growth here in the U.S. A lot of people don't know that. And I think that the diaspora-owned SMEs here in the U.S. can play a critical role, I think, in working with our efforts here, the U.S. efforts, to engage with Africa and businesses on the ground there. The match sometimes is even better between our SMEs and African SMEs as well. So I think that that's really critical. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, and I really should, is the African integration process and the role that that's going to play as a driver for, I think, investment that will be beneficial not just for the Africans, but for those who want to move into Africa and take advantage of the fact that now that the Continental Free Trade Area will come into effect on March 21st. The African heads of state are going to be in Rwanda to sign that. And I think that it's an important step for Africa, but it also is an opportunity for businesses that want to be on the ground there and take advantage of the regional integration and economies of scale that will come from regional integration and a larger, more unified African market.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for all the questions. I'll talk really briefly on the question on rural development, because it's an important one. It's an area that the U.S. Trade Development Agency has been moving more and more into because of U.S. innovation. I think largely in the energy space, where U.S. innovation has come online with new microgrid technology, mini-grid technology that's reaching out outside of the urban areas to bring power to rural areas across Africa. That's been an area of focus for U.S. TDA. In fact, in Senegal, we're going head-to-head against a Chinese company right now to help Senegal extend the grid into the rural communities. So U.S. innovation has actually been really helpful in opening and unlocking markets and U.S. companies' interest in looking at addressing rural development, particularly in the energy sector.
Well, Dan, I already started answering, but I'm from New Jersey, so I always kind of cut in line. But I would say
what exit?
Yeah. Look, on the diaspora point, American companies cannot run their Africa business from London or from Dubai. You've got to be on the continent, and when you're on the continent, you need to hire locals, and diaspora can play a huge role in that. On the investment opportunity, one of the key areas that we've also looked at in the President's Advisory Committee, but is super important, is you have to develop local capital markets. And so you're not going to get those institutional investors, you're not going to get those African diaspora investors until you have those kinds of capital markets that can be leveraged locally. On the rural-urban piece, I would say, from our perspective, one of the things that we're most interested in Africa is using a range of healthcare technologies to connect those rural clinics, those rural doctors or midwives or whatever to the major hospitals. And we can do a lot with medical technology to do that. And I think that's one area we should be very focused on. With respect to South Africa, interestingly, we just launched the results of an innovation barometer, which is basically 3,000 C-suite people around the world being surveyed on innovation. And one of the key findings was there's actually a huge rise in protectionism and C-suite people saying they like protectionism. The one country that actually did not like protectionism based on our survey was South Africa, which is stunning when you think about South African trade policy, as Florrie knows well. So I think this is a moment of change and opportunity in South Africa, and I think we feel very good that we all should be looking at South Africa again.
Just real quickly, I couldn't agree more on the diaspora point. At OPIC, we require a U.S. nexus for our projects so that their U.S. investors are involved, and oftentimes it's a diaspora member that serves that purpose. And then on the rural small business, I mentioned kind of the power plant example. That's one thing, but also another thing that we do a lot of is just kind of identifying local banks that we can lend money to that then on-lend to smaller businesses so that you get at the small businesses, which are often the key drivers of economies. On South Africa, just to echo Del, real chance to turn the page and have engagement. The NSC Senior Director for Southern Africa, Adrian Bogart, was just down in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and I think that's a really good sign just of U.S. engagement early on right away. And then, Dan, you asked earlier what should the U.S. government be doing, and I'll just take this opportunity to say, this is a little bit outside my lane, but I would focus like a laser on property rights and titling and looking at new technology. 2 weeks ago in the Journal, there was a piece by former Senator Phil Gramm and Hernando de Soto talking about looking at blockchain technology for systems of titling in Africa and in the developing world. And that is just the key to, we take that for granted here in the United States, that we have a title on our house, I've got a piece of paper, I could take that to the bank, borrow money and start a business off of that piece of paper that's respected. Most countries don't have that system set in place. So I would focus like a laser on that as far as an ingredient for unlocking economic growth.
And that's a role for MCC, that's a role for AID. That stuff is really hard to do, that cadastro stuff, that stuff is super hard. Maybe we got, there are probably people here have made their careers on trying to do that stuff. It's super difficult, but really important. It's wrapped up in things like governance issues, hard to measure, not sexy, hard to go on the Hill and get money for that stuff. There's no constituency to go lobby for cadastros and land titling. But I'm with you. I agree. And so we need to do a lot more of that stuff. Maybe blockchain's going to help us untap that and fix it, I wanted to give Aaron or our friends at the Department of Commerce a chance to specifically reflect on the South Africa question. And I also wanted the ambassador to reflect on the South Africa question. So Skip Jones, DAS for the Department of Commerce.
Thanks very much, Dan. And on South Africa, it's just one of a number of countries on the continent where they've had recent regime changes. You can think of Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, of course, Angola, recent change, a number of others. And I think what the president recently said in his letter to the African leaders when they met in Ethiopia for the African Union, expressed a great willingness to work with those countries who are willing to engage with the United States for mutual benefit. And if we find that these new regimes are open to doing business with America, that they're open to creating the type of business climate that is conducive for U.S. companies, they'll find a very willing partner in the United States. And so I think Del said it right, it's a moment of great, or Ed maybe has a moment of great opportunity, and we're very enthusiastic about the prospects here. The trip that was mentioned to South Africa and Zimbabwe, our regional senior commercial officer, Pamela Ward, accompanied Mr. Bogart on that trip, and we look forward to assessing the opportunities that come out of the change and moving on them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ambassador, would you want to just comment on this question of South Africa?
Thank you. I think that the changes happened in South Africa and Zimbabwe are very good for us, for the democracy and the freedom, for the freedom of the population. But what I would like maybe to say is that this criteria should not be the only point that we should focus on to make decision to go to Africa. If we want to stay until we erase all the pitfalls in Africa, I think that we'll wait for a long time. Yeah. We can do things together. And for me, the main point to reach is the education of the population. We have to focus all our energy on education. The day will succeed to have like 60% of Africa population who have a knowledge will automatically, how can I say, slow down or downsize the effect of the corruption, the non-respect of the democracy, the lack of the rule of law. You see? So I think that at the same time you can invest, do the business. But the business can continue to move on. Even if at the state level, we have some difficulties with the head of state, you see, in the case. So I think that we can take, we can pay attention to this, but not base our last decision on this point, because things are moving all the time.
You got time for two quick questions. This woman here, and this gentleman there. You get extra credit for keeping it short, everybody. So, yeah, go ahead, ma'am.
Well, I'm going to start out by saying my name is Dr. Tony Luck.
I'm with the African Business Roundtable. I've been in Africa 28 years. I found that you don't have to be born in Africa. Africa has to be born in you. So I'm an African, a kidnapped African that went back.
I know.
As a matter of fact, it's true. I just came through the door of return at Badagry, and I'm now a citizen of Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
I live in South Africa, was part of the regime change. I hate that word, regime change. When we talk about Western governments, we talk about governments. When we talk about Africa, we talk about regimes. I think we ought to change that. It's not a regime, it's a new government. That's the first thing. I don't have a question, but I do want to just straighten out a couple things. Just 1 minute on China. China has no more room for people, Mr. Ambassador. So the reason they're on the ground is because they need a place to live. So we need to be very clear about that as Americans. They don't do any deal without people. So they bring their money, and they insist that they bring people. 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. They are not transferring technology. They are not transferring technology. They're bringing their own people, and they're not increasing Africa's employment for Africans. So we need to consider that as a real thing.
Okay.
When we talk about America gives 10 billion, 100 billion, we don't give it to anyone. We give it to American companies. And I think the real important missed opportunity is what Florey's organization, of which I'm a board member, and African Business Roundtable, you need to make deals with indigenous business people on the ground. You need to, because a lot of the corruption, the money's going to government. That's not working. It hasn't worked for 50 years. When we were in the Cold War, it might have worked, but then we put people in business like Mobutu. So, I mean, what did that get us? And now we're suffering in the Congo. So we need a new paradigm shift. We have diasporans and local people who can talk to you about how that works and finding good, strong indigenous companies. There are lots of them that are doing 50 million, 100 million, a billion. But we give the money to governments. So, $10 billion for one man is a lot, but it's not enough for a country. So if a president can be corrupted, which we find this, okay, so I'm just saying we have a lot to do about that.
So we're going to give this gentleman the last word over here. No, the gentleman back there, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, buddy. You get that gentleman last
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, I think this is a very useful meeting, and I would like to congratulate you especially for the ambassador bringing him here. One, because I think in discussions of this nature, we tend to gaze our own navels and forget to ask the question, what is it that the Africans really want? What is their objective situation now? And what strategy will they like to follow? 60 years ago, when you asked me who was the partner of Africa, or at least in Ghana, because I'm from Ghana, in the development process, I would have pointed to America because of the role that they played in creating the Volta River Project, which was a productive infrastructure which made a big transformational impact in Ghana. Currently, the Africans are really on the verge of pursuing a strategy of building productive infrastructure so that they will be able to play a role in the international division of labor. But it's not just simply the what. I think Peter Volcker is right when he says that it's the investment in infrastructure which the Africans are quite interested in, but it's also the how. What type of partnership are you going to build with African entrepreneurs? Who is going to relate to who? Why is it that the American businesses think that somehow or the other they've lost out to the Chinese? Because the Chinese experience in Ghana, anyway, it's not all that positive. It's not all positive. They've been able to leverage cheap financing from the Exim Bank and from the development banks in China. But the negative impacts have been very clear, as the last speaker did say. and they have not been able to basically forge useful relationship with the African aspiring EPC contractors, who there are, both in the area of infrastructure building and everything else. If America is going to do something different, then they have to rethink how they are going to partner, not just simply with the diaspora, but the actually aspiring businesses, EPC contractors in the Africa, who will guarantee them against political risks, because they are on the ground and they know the situation better. Thank you. Also,
All right, I'm going to give the ambassador the last word. Could you just reflect a little bit on what you've just heard here, and then we're going to have to end it. So I'm going to give you the last word, ambassador.
I heard that with China, there is no transfer of technology. There is no, they come with their own workers. Okay, that is right. But I think that this point is not the fault of the China. It's the fault of we African. Yes. It's our fault. Thank you very much. Because even the Europeans, when they came in Africa, they came with all the equipment, the people, because they were not sure that they will find people there to work as they want. Okay? But when we arrived, maybe incrementally, they succeeded to train people and to have good workers. So with the Chinese, you can do the same. I remember, you know, there was a bid between two big companies of plane, Boeing and Airbus in China, to sell planes. But the China, they refuse to sell, to buy only the plane. They say they will work, they will buy where the company will accept to construct, to build the plane, a part of the plane in their own country. Okay? So, we Africans, we can do the same. We should have our own conviction. So, don't accuse the Chinese, accuse ourselves. Okay? It's my own opinion. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, I was just kidding. I want to give Flory the last word because I think she's got a very important message. Then we're going to end it. Flory.
So one of the things that I was doing when I was preparing for this was trying to make sure that I understood all the facts, because I think many of us jumped to the conclusion that because China is so engaged on the continent that they are ahead of everybody on investment. And let me just say, on investment flows, FDI flows, China is moving very rapidly. And in 2016, I think they increased their flows sort of 10 times over. So they will catch up with the US. But if you take a number of studies, and I want to just hold this up, this is from the UNCTAD World Investment Report for Africa. And it's comparing 2010, which is the orange line, to 2015, which is the green line. The US is still the largest stock investor in Africa. And yes, China will catch up. I'm not missing that point. But we should all still be clear that as of 2015, it was US first, UK second, France third, and China fourth. So again, what I would say is let's not lose sight of the fact that there is a lot of US investment in Africa already. When you hear the GEs talking about what they're doing, when you hear all of the US companies, many of which are members of the Corporate Council on Africa, you know, they are very focused on Africa and have boots on the ground and are doing a lot there. So I just want to be clear that we need to look at what are the facts, and then we need to look at what are the trends. The last thing I'll say is that what China is investing in Africa is different than what we're investing in Africa. And so we need to be careful about sort of how the two trends will work and the extent to which it will benefit Africa one way or another.
All right. Please join me in thanking everybody who is up on the stage. Thank you.